Welcome everybody. I'm super excited to do this video on the Nest framework. As an Angular and Node developer, I'm very happy to have stumbled across this framework. So let me give you a little introduction to what we'll be building today. And this is just going to be an introduction to NestJS. We're going to build the CRUD application, and you can see the endpoints here in Postman. We can go ahead and we can post our message, our post. We can go ahead and we can get our post, and if we were to post a second one, we can also get back all of our posts here. We can look at one of our IDs, so let's say the ID 3. So if we change the URL parameter to have a 3 here, we can say that this is an updated post. And if we go ahead, we can confirm that. We can see that this is an updated body. And finally, we can go ahead and we can just delete a post. And if we get all of our posts back, here we go. Now this is super exciting because it's done with NestJS and it's just a beautiful framework. I really enjoy working with it. So without further ado, let's get into building it. So what we'll start off by doing is we'll open VS Code, and I'm going to be in this project folder. I've already called it LinkedIn clone, and that's because I'm building a LinkedIn clone, a basic version of one with NestJS and Ionic with Angular. But you can follow this video, no worries, with just Nest if you like, or I got another series on just the Ionic, so they're going to be built in tandem, but they're decoupled from one another, so you can watch them individually. So the very first thing you want to do is you want to open up your command line, and you want to download nest.js and install it. And I should mention at this point, you should be familiar with how to build a CRUD application in Node and or Angular, preferably both, to get the full benefits from this video. And if you haven't, I got a playlist on both of those on my channel. So the command you want to enter into your project folder is npm i-g at nestjs/cli. And like Angular, it gives you the command line interface to be able to generate modules and services and all of that. So go ahead and just install that. I've already got that, but note that if you've got an older version of Nest already, it will update that for you. So I've already done that. So while that loads, I'll run the next command, and then I'll explain a little bit of an overview of NestJS. So I'm just going to create an API folder in this project. So with the NestJS CLI, we can run nest new API. And that's going to ask us if we want to use npm or yarn. I'm going to use npm. And while that's installing, I'll just explain a little bit about Nest. So NestJS, it's a Node framework, and it builds upon Express, and it's used to build large, complex application in a consistent manner. It combines features of Angular, such as modules, services, and it uses TypeScript, and you can also use Rxjs with it, and we will do so in this series. And it combines that with the MVC, Model View Controller design pattern, and it really helps embrace a clean architecture. So there's lots of complaints from Node backend code bases that they're really messy and they have growing pains in terms of scalability and all of that. And when you compare it to more robust enterprise solutions such as a .NET or a Spring, you can really start to see some issues there. But the main benefit of NestJS, and particularly if you're already an Angular developer or a Node developer, is that you can quickly learn how to build these robust backend applications with your existing skills, and that's without sacrificing any code quality, and that just makes Nest an absolute great choice for those sorts of developers. So you can see that when we've generated this, similar to an Angular CLI, and I'm just going to CD into the API, that you get a little bit of boilerplate here. So we can have a look at the folder structure, and like a typical boilerplate project, you know, you get your package JSON where all your dependencies are, and your node modules where all your dependencies are. You have some tsconfig build and JSON options here, and you don't really need to touch these. This is just more to output your directory and your target format of JavaScript and other you know, settings such as that. It also comes with ESLint, prettier, so we've just got single quotes instead of double quotes and trailing commas, or of course the lock JSON version, README. You've got the Nest CLI. This is this doesn't need to be touched at all really, but it just has the source root in this source folder. We've got some testing here, but we won't do any end-to-end testing. So then we've got the source folder here, and this is the most interesting part. So similar to an Angular application, we got this main TS file here, and it's all TypeScript, which is amazing. This is the entry point to the application, and we can see what it does here is it uses this Nest factory, and that creates an app similar to in Node, and it listens to that server. And this Nest factory is essentially all of the Nest tooling that we need for our Node application, and it embraces modularity. So when we first load the application, it bootstraps this Nest application, and the main section it loads is our app module. So if we take a look at our app module, what we can see is it has these things called controllers, and we should be familiar with what a controller is already. It's basically the it handles the logic between requests and responses. And it should be noted that a module can also have other modules in it, and this main app module can actually have other modules, such as, so if we're building a LinkedIn clone, you know, we could have a post section for the feed, and that's a whole section by itself. If you're not familiar with modules, that's basically a designated section, and we can bring all of those modules which contain controllers and services of themselves and bundle them all together here, and that's essentially how the application works. So the modularity is cool because it has all the lazy loading features with it and stuff like that, and the just splitting the code and having a large code base, just having a clean architecture for it's really, really nice. But yeah, so the service, this might be a new concept to Node developers that haven't used Angular, and essentially in a controller, when we're handling our request, we want that, like a component, to be quite lean. So we basically delegate all of the logic, especially the logic that's interacting with the database, to the service, and then the controller handles that. It uses it through injection, and we're going to see how all this works. So what we can do to start off is we just need to get a few things here. So I'm going to use Postgres, and because I'm using Postgres, I'm also going to use an ORM. So I'm going to use type ORM because type ORM is in TypeScript, and it's the most mature of the ORMs, so it works really, really great with NestJS. So I'm just going to go ahead and install Nest, the NestJS version of type ORM, which sits on top of type ORM, and Postgres. And it should be noted that you can use any database here, preferably an SQL based database, but because that's what we'll be doing in this example. But you can use whatever you like. And I'm also going to install this config. And what the config will allow us to do is essentially the config, the config module itself, it allows for our variables. So we're going to have some Postgres variables, and later on in another video we're going to have some JSON Web Token variables in our env file, and it builds upon the .env package. So we don't have to install it directly, but it builds on top of that, and that just gives us access to our global variables. So I'll just wait for that to load so we can see that in action, because it makes a lot more sense when you can just see it. But I can okay, so now we're loaded, and we'll see what's happened in our package JSON. So we'll just make sure that we've got those, and we can see that we've got the NestJS config, we've got type orm, we've also got type orm, we do have Rxjs pre-installed, and we've got Postgres here. So in the root of our API folder, we can create a .env file. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to list out a few of my environmental variables for the Postgres database. So it should be noted that I'm using pgadmin4, but you can use whatever you like. Any SQL one will be fine. Any GUI will be fine here. That's just what I'm using. So in this .env file, I'm just going to have a few variables defined here, and notice that there is no quotes around the variables. So the Postgres host, this is going to be on the home port, so 127.0.0.1, and I'm just going to copy that down 5 times because I'm going to have a Postgres port, I'm going to have a Postgres user, I'm going to have a Postgres password, and I'm also going to have a Postgres database. So by default, the Postgres port is just 5432. The user is just Postgres. The password is just whatever your password is. So I'm just going to put password here. And the database, I'm going to call it LinkedIn because I'm doing a LinkedIn clone. So I can go ahead and I can save that. And one thing to note is that I've actually already created this LinkedIn database. That's pretty much all that's in it since I've deleted the post in it. But it's just a LinkedIn database. You don't actually even need the schema or anything. It will build that by using type ORM. So what we want to do in our application is we want to come to our app module, and this is where we're going to import these environmental variables and set up Postgres. So we can import that here. So first we're going to use the config module, and that's what is using those environmental variables. And later on we're going to use a JSON Web Token in another module. So that's why I'm going to add this is global here to true, and I have to import this, of course. And I'm also going to get type ORM, the module for that, and for root, and then I'm going to configure a few things here. So I'll just bring that in first. So I'm going to need the type of the database, and in our case that's just Postgres. We're going to need the host, And now that we've used this configuration module, our type orm module can reference those environmental variables the same way you would have in a .env file if you since it's using that under the hood. So that means on the process.environment variable, we have access to the Postgres underscore host. For the port number, we've also got the process.environmental variable for the port, and I've used uppercase characters here. Now notice that this port is the type string is not assignable to a type number. So we know that this is a string here, and we want to pass this string to an integer since it requires a number. So we can go ahead and pass a string to an integer using the passInt method. Then we can go ahead and we can put our username here. So once again, it's the process.env, and we can call the username variable. We can get our password, which is the process.env Postgres password. We can get our database, and this is what you've called your database here, so I'm just going to use LinkedIn here. So process.env Postgres database, and things that we're going to need is we're going to use a type ORM, so an object relational mapper, and that basically it connects the database through entities, and then it makes those methods through a service that are used in a controller. So we're just going to go ahead and we're just going to go and auto load those entities, and we're also going to synchronize them. Now this shouldn't be used in production because you may lose your data. However, we'll use this for our simple example here. So now that we've got that set up, let's just explain what this is actually doing in detail. So basically the config module, it's allowing for our variables, our Postgres variables in this case, and later our JSON Web Token, to be made accessible from this env file into these environment variables here, but also later we're going to inject them into other modules via a config server. So this sets up a config server service which can be injected into other areas in the application, and that's why we've set this flag is global to true. Now this for root method, this is used quite frequently, and what this for root method does is it may return a dynamic module either synchronously or just standardly, unsynchronously. So then that just returns a promise basically that allows for this dynamic module to be loaded. So, and since we'll use this config module in other modules, that's why we specify the global. Now, with type ORM, so since it's the most mature object relational mapper written in TypeScript, that's why we're using it here. And basically, it's used in our NestJS to abstract interactions with the database. So we'll see later on that you know, when you make queries rather than repeating queries, it just takes that the queries sort of out of the application and abstracts that. And the type ORM, all these are just standard configurations to configure to a database. So one thing we might want to do is we might just want to check that everything is working. So let's just run an npm run start dev, and these are in the package JSON. But essentially, if we go to localhost 3000 here, we're getting a cannot get, and the reason why is because I had the example application already open. So I'm going to stop that server and I'm going to restart this one. And now if we go to this 3000 endpoint, we get our hello world. So recall that the hello world is just coming from our root application. In the service we have this method get hello, and this service method is in our controller. So when we make the get request to the endpoint of nothing, we're going to use this app service get hello method and we're going to return that. So we're going to build up on that same logic, and we're going to create and post all of the CRUD operations there. But one thing I might do just before we get started is in the main TS file, I might prefix everything with API, sorry. So on our app, we can set a global prefix, and I'm going to set this to API. Now if we save this and we make our request here, we cannot get, but I've made it so if you go to API, then you do get the request. So as per Angular, we've been given this nice CLI, and basically you can use it to generate modules, services, controllers. You do need to make your own entities and services, but we'll see that soon. It's very simple. And basically make sure you're in the API folder, and you can then, for this project, we want to generate a feed module, because in our LinkedIn clone there's going to be a feed and there's going to be a bunch of posts on our feed. So let's go ahead and create the feed module. So we can run the command nest and g or for generate, mo for module, and you can type these out in full if you like. And then I'm just going to type in feed, and we'll see what this does is it creates this feed module. And one thing I didn't mention earlier is that in TypeScript and in NestJS that builds upon TypeScript, there is the use of these decorators. So at module, for example, and what these do is it just gives more metadata to the class, where the class is just essentially syntactical sugar over the top of an object. So everything is really just an object with some extra features, and then there's some metadata that provides more information about that object with extra features. So that's true for the module, and it's true for the services as well. So notice that there's a different decorator here. So we get the injectable, and the injectable just means we can inject it into wherever we like. So with that metadata, we're able to, in a constructor in the app controller, we can inject that in, and we can then reference it. So that, I mean, I'm sure that's clear for any Angular developers, but just in case there's no developers interested in the NestJS framework but haven't yet used Angular, imagine most people would have used Angular because it's one of the main selling points for using it, but there's also some React developers that really like in TypeScript and want to use it. So there you go. So all that did was it just generated this feed module. But if you go to our app module, you'll notice that it also referenced it. So remember that the app module, it bundles all of our modules and services and stuff together. Now we don't have to reference the services and controllers of the feed module in our app module, because the feed module bundles that up for us. So we just need to reference that, and then we import that in. So what we can also do in addition to our feed module is we can go ahead and we can generate our first service and controller. So let's get our service first. So NestJS, and we're going to have a folder, well, in the feed folder, we're going to have a folder called controllers, and we're going to call it feed. And by default, this creates a feed folder within the controllers folder, but we don't want that. So we can just specify that we want it to be flat. And we won't be doing any testing in this video, so we can also just say no-spec. So we don't want the spec file, similar to when you use the CLI in Angular. So we can see that we've made this controllers folder, and we have our feed service, and it's ready to go. One thing to mention though is the feed service, it is actually in our providers of our module. So in Angular you don't actually need to reference it directly because there's a for root in the injectable, but in this case we will need to reference it in our module. So that's just something to remember. If you're using the CLI, it should do it automatically anyway. One more thing we can get is we can get our controller. So you can either type in controller or CO for short. I just realized I named it wrong here, so let me just rename this before I carry on. This should be services. So this is services, and then we will update that, and then that just changed that, so no big deal. Now we can just generate our controller in the controller section, and then it turns out the command will be the same, but in the previous step you just needed services there instead. So let's go ahead and do that. So now we've got our controllers, and we've got our feed controller, and by default you can see here it says controllers, and then inside the controller there is a feed. So that means in addition to us going to the API endpoint to get our hello world, we can go to API/feed in our controller, and then with that request what we want to do is we want to give a response back. So let's just start off by having a look at the request structure. And actually even before that we're going to need our models. So before we can access our data or anything like that, we're going to need our model and our entity. So let's go ahead and in our feed section here, I'm going to create a new folder called models, and then I'm going to have a file called post.interface.ts. So we need the interface and the model. The interface is for IntelliSense and type checking for that particular type, and the entity is for the database building and connection for the interactions there. So all we need to do, and I'm not going to do the full interface here, this is just going to be a partial interface. We'll build on it in the subsequent videos. But essentially, I'm going to have a number here. Oops. We're going to have a body here. And we're going to have a created at here. And notice that all of these are optional, and that's because the created at and ID, they're going to be generated automatically. And the body could be you know, like an empty string or something like that, or it might not be passed. So that's the interface. And then if we have a look at our post entity, so I'll go ahead and I'll create that. So post.entity, notice the .entity types here. And that's another thing I should have mentioned, is automatically has this, if it's a controller, has a controller, or models have an entity or interface, or service has service, a module has a module. Now, not everything has that. It's mainly just those. There's also an auth guard, and but they're the main ones. So you don't want to just go ahead and just start making up everything on your own. There are some predefined ones. Of course you can, everything will still work, but part of the reason for using Nest is due to the opinionated structure. So you sort of just follow the protocols in general, unless you have a good reason not to, but you can do whatever you want. So basically what we want to do is we want to have an interface. We want to make our entity from our interface. So this class, we need to export this class, and I'm going to call this feed post entity, and it's going to take a special decorator here, and that is the entity decorator. And I'm just going to call this feed post. So let's take an entity from type orm, and we're just going to need to sort of specify our database. So the first thing we're going to need is we're going to need the primary key. So we got the primary generated column, and this is for the ID, which is a number. We can also have a column, and the column is just going to have a body, and that's just going to be a string. And we're going to have another column, and this is just going to be of a date. So we'll say we created a post which has a body at a certain date. So there's a date here. Now by default the body could just be a blank string. In the created at, we need to specify that the type is actually of this thing called a timestamp. And by default, when we create our new entry, it's going to just be of the current timestamp. So whatever time we submitted it, that's what we're going to get for our entity. So the reason we create an entity is because type ORM, it supports this thing called the repository design pattern, where each entity, so this is an entity, each of these entities has its own repository obtained from the database connection. So we make our database connection, and then we're able to make our own repository. Now type orm does this for us behind the scenes, but essentially what it does is it allows us to minimize any duplicate query logic. So let's say we need to get all of our posts. If we need to do that twice in two different sections rather than reusing the same query, re-implementing the same query, we could minimize that there. So the entity, it defines the format of the table in the database, and once the database connection has been made to our API server, with the help of type orm, we get access to database methods that abstract the query logic from our application. So we'll see this in action. So in our feed module, for us to be able to implement this, we need to actually import something from type orm that sets that up for us. So in the type orm module, we need to do this thing called for feature, And for our feature of our entity type, so we got here feed post entity, and we just need to inject that and put a comma here. So essentially what we've done in our feed module is we've used the type ORM to use the repository design pattern for us, such that we are able to use queries easily. And we'll see this, and we'll do this now. I'll just overwrite that. Now, to see this in action, we'll finally get to making our CRUD application. And now that everything's set up, this is going to be quite straightforward. But it's important that we have a fundamental understanding of everything, because everything's going to build up on top of these same concepts. So that's why I've taken the time to get into it a little bit. So the first thing we're going to need is we're going to need a post request. And in our controller, and let's just say we're going to create something here, and we're going to return something. So, and I can close this now, and I can close the entity now, and the app service and the app module, and even this and this. So we just got two files open we're going to work in, is the feed controller and feed service. So we make an API request to /API/feed, and the first thing we want to do is we want to post some data there. So we need to use this decorator called post, so it reads it as a post request, and then we need to, then it fires a method. Now this can be called whatever you want, but ideally it's called something relevant for readability purposes. So I'm going to create a post here. Now I haven't called this create post, and this is personal preference, because rather than calling this create post or create feed post, since it's already decorated as a post, it's sort of implied that it is a post. So we're creating a post, and we're going to use this feed service. So it's actually also implied that it's going to be related to the feed. The part before it says service is going to be related to that. So we're going to create a feed post, essentially, and it's nice and readable, and it's not overwritten or anything like that, because we know naming variables is one of the hardest things you can do in programming. So what we're going to do is we're going to, well, firstly what we need to do is we need to, in our feed service, now you can actually inject services into services. So we can just get our constructor here, because we're going to need a service in here. And this is going to be slightly different to what you've seen in Angular. Only in this case, because we're injecting the repository from the entity that we've created. So usually you can just say something like this, like private, and we can make it read only as well, just so we can ensure that we're not doing anything with the service directly. So I'm going to call this feed post repository, which is of the type repository, and that's coming from type ORM. And then it's the name of our entity. So we name that feed post entity, and we're going to have to bring this in from our models. Now, one thing in addition to that we need to do is we also need to give this some metadata. So we need to say @inject repository, and then we just need to reference the name of that entity. So as I said before, we are using the repository design pattern, which is abstracted for us with type ORM, based on the entity that we defined, and then we're going to get given a bunch of methods that we can use to interact with the database without actually writing the queries ourselves, and also we can reuse the queries without duplication. So let's just go ahead and we'll get our create post going. So I'll make our first method here, create post, and we're going to get our feed post of the type feed post. And okay, we'll come back to the type here, but we're going to need the model, the interface model of feed post. And what we're going to do is we're going to return this dot feed post repository, and we're going to call save with the feed post. And this is exactly what the repository does for us. It gives us this method for us without actually defining that method, and that's just coming from type ORM. And these methods are basically these sorts of, they're named in this sort of way. So we're going to have save, update, find, all of those basic methods there. Okay, so we've implemented our feed service with our injected repository with the feed post entity, and we're now able to connect from the database with this layer of abstraction of the repository pattern into our service. So we're able to use this service into our controller, and to do that we need to inject that service into our controller. So that means we're going to need a constructor, and we can have a private feed service here of the type feed service. That should be lowercase. And now what we can do is we can just simply use that. So when we hit the endpoint API/feed with the post method, we can go ahead and we can just return this .feed service, create post method, and we're going to need our post. So where are we going to get our post from? Well, there's also another decorator here. So we're going to have our post of the type feed post. So we inject, we'll get that in here as well. But this is coming from the body of our request. So if I type in here another decorator, body, prefix before our post and feed post, we're now able to get that. Now, one thing I might add is this here. What is the return type of this? Since we're using NestJS, which has TypeScript, we may as well use the full features of that, and Rxjs in particular. So we want to actually make this an observable. So we have the we can use Rxjs, and then it's more in line with our Angular code, and it's more powerful too. So if rather than returning this promise here, we want to convert our promise into an observable. So we can just go ahead and we can just say observable here, and it's going, when we create the post, it actually returns the post to us, and it's going to be of the type that we sent it, which is just the feed post. So we're going to need to get this observable from Rxjs. Now this this now looks like it doesn't work, and that's because if you look at this return statement, it's expecting a type of promise of the feed post, but we've converted it into an observable. Now, how do you get from a promise to an observable? Well, you can use Rxjs, and in particular, you can use the from method to create an observable from Rxjs. So when we save that, when we create it, we're returning what we get back from the service, so it's going to be of the same type there. So we can go ahead and we can just say, okay, let's just grab that observable in, and after that we should now be able to post. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's run our server. So we can say npm run start, and we're going to do start dev, so it just keeps watching for it in development mode. Now let's go back to our /API. So we're still getting hello world there. Now let's just check. Yep, so the server's still running, and we've got our post method now. So let's say this is a body 3. I don't know why that in particular, but okay, so we're getting a 404 here. Cannot post to /API/feed. So why would that be the case? Now, for whatever reason, the CLI did not add the feed controller, and that could have been because I had some naming issues before. So I'm sure if you've done things correctly, you wouldn't have had this issue. But essentially what I'm going to do in the controllers, in the feed module, basically we're going to need the feed controller here, because essentially that wasn't being called at all, and that's the main thing that does the work of taking the HTTP requests for the endpoint. So hopefully that works now. So let's retry that. So let's send our request, and we get this is a body 3. And if we go to our PG admin and we refresh our feed post table in our LinkedIn database, we can go ahead and we can view all rows, and then we get for our first primary key, we get the body. This is a body 3. Awesome. How awesome is that? And then we also got the created at, which just happened at the same time as I am recording. So now we've set pretty much everything up. The rest of the methods are going to be relatively easy because they're going to follow that same sort of approach. So let's say we want a method for finding all our posts. So in our feed service, we're going to have find all posts. And we want this to return an observable, which is going to be all of our feed posts that we've made. So in anticipation for that, let me say this is a body 3. And change that to this is a body 4. And notice we do indeed get that object back for the feed post. Now I've chosen 3 and 4 because I did 1 and 2 before. So logically you'd think I would do 1 and 2 when I restarted this, but doesn't really matter. It's just dummy data. So we get this error, but if we return something, we get rid of that error there. But of course we need to return the right thing, and we're going to use from, because the service by default is going to, the repository method by default of this dot feed post repository, there's a find method which returns a promise, and we're just going to convert that to an observable once again. And because we don't specify any options, it's just going to go ahead and get all of those for us there. So we can save that, and I might just stop the server for no particular reason. So if we go back to our controller, this time we want to make a GET request, and we want to make that GET request to /API/feed. So we can actually get this one in the browser if we like. So let's just find all of our stuff, and everything we're going to find is of the type observable feed post. So you can more or less just copy these over. And what we're going to do is we're going to return, and this one does not take any parameters at all. So this one's nice and simple. We can just go ahead and we can find all of our posts. So let's save that. Let's get our server back up so we can see this. I was going to do them all in a row, but we may as well see it working. It's probably better to work on them one at a time so we don't get any major errors throughout. It's a general good rule to follow that nobody follows. But and if you're using Postman, I don't know if I said this before, but if you might be getting an error, and that's because you might be on the text type, so make sure you're on the JSON type. I'm sure all developers are run into that issue before. So in the body, raw JSON. Now the GET request to this endpoint here, 3000/API/feed. This does not have any parameters in the body, but this should get our ID 1 and 2 for the post body, which says 3 and 4. So we know that works. Now all we really got to do is we just need to do our put and delete method. So let's start in our service. We can say that we want to update our post here, and just take a look at the naming convention here, guys. It's sometimes you see the name having the exact same name, but I find this kind of confusing personally. Not that it doesn't really matter, but a personal preference here is to have the ORM method that's doing the mapping with the repository method, have that different to this method here, because when you use it over here, it just eliminates that sort of overloading there. So in the service, I like to have relatively descriptive names. So find all posts, create posts, and the fact that it's a feed service implies that you're creating posts for the feed and or finding all posts from the feed, such that when we in the controller, because we've already got this post or get here, this method here I usually make a little shorter because the feed service is creating the post, so we're creating a post for the feed. Just sort of, and this method it gets called when you hit the endpoint, so this can be called whatever you want it to be, but I generally like this one to be short, this one to be descriptive. So this one's short because it has the endpoint, the method implied, but in the service it's not, it's implied by the name sort of thing, and it's different to this method here. So you know, you don't have to take that on board, but that's just a personal preference I like to do. So when we update the post here, how are we going to update the post? Well, we're going to have a particular post which is uniquely defined by its ID. So we're going to get that ID, and it's going to be a number, and it's coming from the parameters. So it's going to be a string, so we're going to have to coerce it to a number in the controller. That's just an important thing to keep in mind. But we're also going to, let's say we update the body, we're going to need and this is going to have more properties later on, so we're going to need the entire object of the feed post. You know, obviously it's not going to have the ID and created at or whatever, but all the other properties. So in this case it's just the body, but for scalability purposes I'm going to call this feed post, and this will turn an observable, but it's not clear of what type just yet. So what we're going to do here is we're going to return, and once again the repository methods are going to bring a promise, so we need to convert that to an observable. And it also has this one called update that's built into it, and as a first parameter it takes that ID, and it's also going to need the data that it's going to update for that ID. So we're going to have the feed post here. Now, what is this returning? Well, we know it's returning an observable of some type, but what's the type here? Well, basically it's got type ORM has its own, if you make an update or delete for a certain parameter, you usually get an object back saying how many rows affected and raw and stuff like that. And you could actually convert this, because we're using Rxjs, so we could convert this to the particular post that we're updating, but for simplicity we won't do that just yet. We might do that later on if it's needed in our front end, but we can just actually have this update result type here, and as you see it's coming from type ORM, and I'll show you what this is in just a minute. We'll make the request in Postman and we'll see what that is, but I'm also going to need this in our put request. So recall that update is a put request, so we use the put decorator here. Now, one thing we need to do here, and it should be noted that we're going to API/feed, so you may have deduced, but if we had something here like put, this actually goes to API/feed/put endpoint, but we're going to need the ID of the post that we've sent. So whatever the feed post ID is, that's what we need, and we can get that from the slug or the parameter. So because this is dynamic, we can actually prefix it with a colon. So let's just call this method something simple. Let's just call it update. And the update, we know that it's going to return something of this type here. So we can have that there. And then in our method body, so we're going to need the update result, from type ORM. And it's erroring because we're not returning anything. But if we use our service that we created, now we can, and we need our feed service, then we can use the update post method, and we can pass in the ID and whatever our feed post is. So we will need in the body the feed post. So let's get that going. Let's just copy that. One thing I noted while I was looking at that is I call this variable post instead of feed post. Usually I have this as a lowercase version of that, but it doesn't really matter. Actually, I will go ahead and change that to feed post. And we need the ID as well, so we can actually get this from the param. So there's this other decorator here, and we get it from the param ID, which we've essentially labeled this as the variable ID, and we know that it's dynamic, so it's going to get that dynamic ID parameter for us, and we can just call that ID. And we know when something's coming from the string, usually it is a when something's coming from a URL, it's usually a string, but if we coerce it to the number type, this param actually becomes a number. So with that, we should be able to actually use that and update our one of our posts here. So because we've said this is post 3 and this is post 4, it'd be appropriate to use the put method in Postman for the ID 1, and let's just say that this is an updated body, and see how we get this type back. Generated maps raw and affected. This relates to this update result type here, so it's of that type. And as I said previously, you could have you could use Rxjs to return the particular type, but at this point, having that is having the actual post that was updated isn't actually needed for us. So if it is, we'll add it in later, in a much later video. But if we go ahead and we get all of our feed posts back, notice that the latest one is now here. Now the created at date didn't change, and maybe later we'll have an updated date as well, but because it's changed, it's been put down the bottom here, and we can see that this is an updated post. So let's just change the second one as well. This is an updated body, sorry, and let's change this to this is an updated body also. Get that, and now we can relax because we don't have any error messages in our body. So the final thing we'd want to do is do our delete method, and we can see once again we got this special object type here. This is just raw and affected to say how many rows was affected, so one entry was affected here. So let's go ahead and implement our final CRUD operation in VS Code. So let's go to our feed service, and this one's really easy, guys. We can just go ahead, we can delete the post based on our ID, which is of a number. This is going to be an observable, and akin to the update result, this is going to be a delete result. So that's coming from type ORM as well. I got my auto imports going. So because it's a promise in return from our repository method of the delete, for the ID, we just convert that into the observable, and we go ahead and we can just use that in our controller here. So all we need to do is we just need to decorate our method with the dynamic ID path of the thing that we're deleting. It's going to, once again, it's going to take those same parameters. It's going to have this same first parameter, this number type here. So we can copy that in. We can almost copy this, but we actually can just copy this instead. So let's get that going as the return type, the observable of the delete result, and of course we're going to need to get that from type ORM, and all we need to do is just return that now. So we can call this .feed service, we can delete the post, and we can get the ID from the parameter. Alright, let's try that. So we know when we get it, we get our two results from the database. We get an ID of 1, an ID of 2. Let's go ahead and delete this ID of 2. So if I go delete request to API/feed/2, we get one row affected here. And this is the return type of the delete result. And if we come back to our get request, getting all, we get just one request now. So we know that works. So we've implemented all of our CRUD operations with NestJS. One thing to note is we obviously wouldn't want to give the authorization for everyone to just put and delete requests like that. So what we're going to do in a subsequent video is we are going to implement authentication and authorization. Now I have already made a Node and Angular series on that. So we're going to mix things up a little bit, and we're going to do some role-based authentication. And that's using some passport under the hood and stuff like that. So if you'd like to continue on with this series, that's likely to be one of the next coming videos. If you want to see this hooked up on a front end, I'm also going to explore Ionic and Angular and connect the data up so we have a full stack application. You can choose, maybe you just want to leave it there, you got the CRUD skills and you want to just sort of go on your own and explore deeper, or it's not for you or something like that. But if you're an Angular developer and a Node developer, maybe you want to see the full stack LinkedIn clone, or you might just be interested in just the backend. You might be using, React, but you really like TypeScript and Rxjs and clean structure. So you might just want to follow along with the Nest series. So I'm going to release these. I'm going to try and get a few in each week until the series is over. And yeah, if you want to show your appreciation, please just subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to get to 1,000 subscribers. And yeah, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one, guys. Cheers.